During this Easter season that we are still in, we've been reading the post-resurrection stories of the disciples with a trauma-informed lens. And today's story includes another traumatic experience, but here there's something deeper going on. We now have a better understanding of how trauma comes from a single experience, but it also often develops over time as a result of many minor events. We understand that every emotional experience that we have wires our brain either for empathy or for fear, wires it for either security or shame. Our experiences wire our brains and our bodies for love and empathy or for hating those that we blame for whatever we feel we lack. And this, I think, is what our story in Acts is revealing. Now, the story is about Stephen on first look. We have met Stephen when he's chosen to be one of the first deacons. He has joined in this work of getting food out to those in need, to operate a first century food pantry. And somehow in encountering Jesus, he had changed the way he looked at life. He changed the way that he lived his life. He kept trying to explain to others like how this change came about and what had happened. But some people didn't like the changes. Some were threatened and afraid of these people who were changing the way that things had always been done. Now, when reading this story, normally we focus on Stephen and what he was doing and what happened to him. But this time I'd like to focus on the crowd. What was going on in the crowd? How did they get to this point of committing murder? They were threatened by these followers of Jesus who were pooling their resources and feeding the poor and worshiping at home instead of in the temple. The people who killed Stephen were not criminals. They were not soldiers. They were just upstanding members of society, members of their religious community. They were professionals and priests and everyday people. So what happens to turn disagreements into murder and conversations into crime? In this event, we are seeing, partly what we're seeing is what we call mob mentality, what neuroscientists have come to call emotional contagion. It starts simply when we see someone else's facial expression, and at a subconscious level, our brains activate the same muscles in our own faces. We don't even notice it, but it tends to happen. When we hear another person's tone of voice, especially someone that we respect, we take on their emotion and their mood. When we're close to someone who's laughing out loud at a joke, well, we automatically start to smile. And when we're around people who are angry, we start to resonate and we start to feel and then think, well, yeah, that is terrible. I should be angry. I am angry. Emotions are infectious. And our story of Stephen's death is an example of the contagious spread of emotion. But I don't think this is really just a sudden event here. This is a contagion that takes place and develops over time. This is an example of generational trauma. Now, Resmaa Menakem, in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, describes communal and generational trauma. Now, he's speaking to our time when he writes, while we see anger and violence in the streets of our country, the real battlefield is inside our bodies. If we are to survive as a country, it is inside our bodies where this conflict needs to be resolved. Because what the body most cares about are safety and survival. And whenever something happens to the body that is too much or too fast or too soon, it overwhelms the body and causes trauma. And we can have a trauma response to anything we perceive as a threat. Not only to our physical safety, but what we do, or to what we think, or the things that we care about and the things that we believe in. Now, we've been talking in the last few weeks about the trauma the disciples experienced when they were watching this unfair trial and then the crucifixion of Jesus. But they weren't the only ones experiencing this trauma, because crucifixions happened all the time. This was the government's way of keeping everyone afraid and keeping people in line. So think about it. Children walked past crucified bodies hanging on crosses or poles, each time holding a little more fear inside their bodies. President Menachem reminds us that this is also what happened every time a Black person was lynched in our country. Children, both Black and white, were traumatized, knowing that stepping out of line could get you killed, and white children gradually learning that you're not supposed to feel empathy for these Black people that you just watched die. That is traumatic. The body is where we fear and hope. It's where we react. It's where we reflexively either fight or flee or freeze. And this trauma gets stuck in our bodies, and it stays stuck there until it is addressed. And so over time, for all of us, these fight or flee or freeze responses become embedded in our bodies. They become the standard way of living or in surviving and protecting yourself. If you think about it, you may know what your body's preferred system of response is. When you feel threatened, do you want to fight? When you feel threatened, do you want to run away as fast as you can, or do you just freeze up and not know how to even move? We develop these strategies through time. When they are repeated over and over generations, they become the standard responses in families and in communities, and they become cultures. Menachem suggests that there are two kinds of pain, because we're really dealing with a type of pain. There is clean pain and there is dirty pain, as he defines it. Clean pain is pain that mends and builds your capacity for growth. It's the pain you experience when you are scared and you're worried about what might happen, but you step forward into that unknown and you approach it with honesty and with vulnerability. Dirty pain is the pain of avoidance, of blame and denial. And when people respond from their most wounded parts, they become cruel or violent or physically or emotionally will run away. They experience this what he calls dirty pain, and then they create more of that pain for others as well as themselves. So when we come back to our story here, we realize that the Jewish people in the first century were oppressed by the Roman government. Having been oppressed by governments for centuries before, they learned to hide their fear and their anger and to project it on other groups that they found threatening. So this early Christian community threatened their beliefs and their way of life, and they felt justified in killing off this movement, as we see with Stephen. Unfortunately and sadly, through these centuries, as Christianity gained power, they turned the tables and they projected their fear onto the Jewish community, blaming and trying often to wipe them out, and the cycle of trauma and violence continues. This is what we are experiencing in our contentious public and political discourse in our time. This is at the heart of our increasingly violent culture. We are living on and living out cycles of violence fueled by generations of trauma. Now, we here in our community have seen this play out in one small gesture this week. As our sign out front was defaced, we have chosen to be a congregation that is inclusive of all people, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation or age or status or any distinction. And we shared that message. We often share it in many ways on our sign. This week our message said God loves trans children, and someone chose to turn it into a mean-spirited message. Now, we don't know who did it, but there's something we know about whoever did it. We know that they have learned from their family and from their community and from their media that projecting your fear and pain onto the LGBTQ plus community is acceptable. They have learned from their traumatized community. Harming people within this group is justified. And it's tempting for us to want to retaliate. But Menachem again reminds us, we will not end white supremacy or any other form of evil by trying to tear it to pieces. Instead, we can offer people better ways to belong and better things to belong to. Each of us can build our own capacity for genuine belonging. When we feel threatened, the best thing that we can do is start with ourselves. So with some attention and patience, you can learn to work with your own nervous system, healing your own trauma, your traumatized body, by consciously and deliberately relaxing your muscles and settling your body, learning to soothe yourself in difficult, high-stress situations. He continues, our public discourse, our media, and our policy all unsettle our bodies more than they settle them. The news is supposed to be the news, but it's actually intended to unsettle our bodies and to make us more fearful and to feel more threatened. So the first step in changing these dynamics that we are dealing with, settling our own bodies one by one. And then the next step is bringing that settling out into the world and getting each of our bodies in sync with one another. A settled body helps other bodies it encounters to settle, just like when we smile when somebody is laughing at a joke. When we come across someone who is tense and threatened, we start to feel tense and threatened. When we come across someone who is calm and relaxed, we feel just a little bit more calm and relaxed. Giving bodies the right context and encouragement will begin to harmonize as well. And then over time, enough bodies heal from trauma and learn to harmonize, and that harmony can turn into culture. We can change our culture. When we heal our own trauma individually and collectively, we don't just heal our bodies. By refusing to pass on the trauma we inherited, we will help to heal the world. Now, we are going to continue to look at ways we can heal our own trauma in the weeks ahead, but I want to mention a few helpful things that we are already doing here to settle our bodies, to heal our trauma together. When we sing together, we heal together, because singing brings our nervous systems into alignment and helps to heal the trauma that is within us. When we take time to share our stories in this safe and affirming community, we use that positive emotional contagion and we strengthen and heal one another. When we eat together, it communicates that we are family in the best sense of the word. We begin to meet our basic need for belonging, of feeling safe together. And so, like that, sharing the Lord's Supper in worship is a symbol, a celebration of this healing community that is family. It's a reminder of the one who taught us how to love ourselves and how to love one another. It's a reminder of Jesus who died because this way of love frightened those in power. So now, to prepare our hearts to share this meal together, please join with me in prayer.